All right. Well, welcome everyone to the O'Fallon Chamber webinar, Reopening Practices with our expert panelists. I'd like to give them an opportunity to introduce themselves. We're so happy that they're here. We have KJ Spurlock, we have Katie Magoon, and we have Joseph Markell. Just take maybe a moment to introduce yourself. KJ, do you want to start?
Hi, I'm KJ Spurlock, the owner of Command Solutions. We are a corporate training company that specializes in emergency management processes, how to basically get through a crisis or an event and get back in business. And so my business partner and I are both retired from the fire service, so we cover all types of training from safety practices to leadership and everything from workplace violence to, respirators and CPR. And by respirators, I mean the type of face piece type things you wear, things like that. And so we love to train. We love to be in front of people, and Command Solutions has got the training that counts when seconds matter.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us, KJ. I know that you have a lot of really good information to share with us today. Joseph Markell from Markell Estate Planning. Share a little bit about yourself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Joe Markell. I'm an estate planning attorney, so I primarily work with, obviously, estate planning, probate, and some transactional work. So I'm not an employment law attorney, but I will do my best. I've been trying to stay on top of things best I can, so I'll do my best to bring any useful information that I have. Thanks.
Absolutely. And he helps people who maybe have a business and how they can secure their business for succession and things like that, which is also an important part of this too, because that may still be happening during COVID, right? So thanks so much for joining us, Joseph.
Yeah.
Katie Magoon, last but not least, People Solutions Center. I know we've had you on before, but share a little bit about yourself.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kathy. So I'm Katie Magoon. I'm the owner of People Solutions Center. Kathy Fleming, who you see there, is my business development specialist and my expert extraordinaire in O'Fallon. So we love having her part of this chamber. I'm an HR consultant. I've spent 20 plus years in corporate HR, and then the last 4 years I've owned my own consulting firm, and I work with mostly small to mid-sized companies who are big enough to need HR, but not big enough to necessarily need a full-time HR person. So we've been spending the last, 6 to 9 weeks at this point, helping our clients navigate everything from how do you get everybody home to start, how do you deal with temporary furloughs if that's the route you need to go, and now have been making sure that folks know how to think about their employees and the implications for their staff as they think about reopening. So I'm excited to share that information with everybody here and see what we can do to help folks out.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Katie. I know that a lot of people are going to have questions, especially for you as we start getting employees back into the workplace, or some folks already have, and maybe they have questions of things that have already happened. So thank you so much, all three of you, for joining us today. I'm going to start with you, Katie. Just the first question is, as I reopen, are there safety measures I need to take for my employees? Like if someone gets sick, does it count as workers' compensation? Just maybe start with that question. If someone gets sick, does that count as workers' compensation?
Yes, so this has been one of the interesting questions that is still not 100% clear, but the guidance that we are getting is if one of your employees gets sick, and in particular, there's any possibility that they got sick in your location. So if they've been telecommuting, you're fine. But once you reopen and people start coming back in, if someone then gets sick, you now have the potential that it came from someone in your office. And so the guidance that we've been giving is at that point, call your work comp carrier. Notify them and let them be the experts on whether or not it is appropriate, because what that allows them to do is they can get in contact with the employee and ask the questions that need to be asked to determine if it's a work comp case, But they also then can get into health questions that you as an employer do not want to be the one dealing with and getting additional information. And so let the work comp carrier determine that. Again, you only need to worry about it if there's any chance that they got it at work, which I would say if they're in the building, if they're seeing clients, those kinds of folks are the ones that you would want to report.
Now that kind of leads into a really good question over to you, Joe, just about are businesses at risk of being sued for bringing employees in and potentially maybe they get sick or something? Can you talk a little bit more about that, the risk?
So, like Katie said, this is really a developing area, and the answer is that there hasn't been time for this to be litigated yet. It would seem not from a very practical standpoint, simply because if someone's going to file a lawsuit against a business, they're going to have to show by a preponderance of the evidence that it's more likely than not that they contracted the disease or condition at your business, which is pretty hard to do scientifically. A defense attorney can get up there and say, well, who else did you have contact with, and just go through the list. So it's not likely, but I would say that by all means, whatever the best practices is that are being published by the CDC, even OSHA has gotten in on this. So whatever they're saying to do as far as social distancing or providing PPE for employees, I would say definitely do whatever the best practices are to mitigate that risk as much as possible.
Absolutely, absolutely. And to touch on what Katie said, call workers' comp, have them still ask those questions because it's only protecting your business, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
Right.
And I think, Kathy, I think that's really, I'm sorry, go ahead, KJ.
Go ahead, Katie.
I was going to say, Kathy, I think that's probably the most important thing that employers need to think about as we're reopening is it's not always about whether or not you could get sued or get sued for this, but it's more about your brand, both as an employer and as a company. You want to make sure that people, if something happens to one of your folks, you do not want to be the news story on 5 o'clock news that you didn't take the right precautions or you brought people back when maybe you really didn't need to. So it's important that you think about how will people feel about the decisions you've made if something goes wrong. And so it's really, especially your employees, these are people you want with you for a long time. And the fact that you led with heart during this is going to make a big difference. And yes, there are employers that need to bring people back, but you can bring people back and still have the heart to make sure that people are being safe, not getting frustrated with people who are scared, not getting upset with people. And I think that's the part that you have to ask yourself is your human side coming out? And then if somebody gets sick, everybody's going to feel bad, but they're not necessarily going to come at you with a lawsuit over it.
Thank you. KJ, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I'm going to follow along with that, and some of that will come back on Katie's shoulders too, but it's document. What steps did you take as a business owner to protect your employees and your customers that come into your place of business? And some of the things that we'll talk about today, some of those administrative or engineering controls, make sure that they're documented and you had policies in place that everyone, and not only were the policies put out there, but then they were trained on and the employees knew that, and that's where it comes back on Katie, to make sure that those are written out so that you're not just trying to go, well, we did this and we did that, but no, it's you have it, and it's written down.
Absolutely. KJ, do you want to expand on that as places are reopening? What are maybe some processes and some practices that they need to have in place for their facility?
Well, part of it, you've got basically 3 things that you're going to put into place. You have your engineering controls, your administrative controls, and your workplace practice procedures. So engineering controls, you've seen them around town when you go to the grocery store somewhere, the plexiglass, things like that. Maybe you have a warehouse and you can control the ventilation system and generate a higher turnaround on the air cycle per minute, things like that to get more air into the building. Administrative controls are back on your policies again. Talk about social distancing and hand washing. and have those guidelines on what to do out there. And that's part of your work safe place practices too, that the employees they understand that, and they've been trained on those policies and procedures and how to be safe and how to report something if that does happen.
What about KJ when interacting with customers? What are some ways in which we can prepare our customers if we're a customer face-to-face company? What can we do to prepare our customers to keep the employees safe?
That's a communication, and that's one of the guidelines that FEMA recommends, is how are you going to communicate with your clients and your customers, from signage on the front door to sending out an email that this is how we're dealing with our customers. We put the glass up, the plexiglass, and we would like you to put your card under the glass. Then we were going to put sanitation equipment out there for you to wipe off the carts or wipe off your credit card once you've used it. So, but it's more of a communication process to your customers and your vendors as well. Who's coming into your building? And if you have a vendor that's bringing things into your building, what are their workplace practices and what are they following under, so that you know what your representative that's coming in to do work inside that they're following the same guidelines as what you are. But it's a communication thing. And sometimes I know there's conflict out there right now with the mask. Do I wear a mask? Do I not wear a mask? But it's about taking the steps as an employer, especially when you're providing services, to make the customer feel comfortable. Is your employees wearing a mask? Are they behind the protective plexiglass? Are they keeping their social distance? You want your customers to feel like they care about me and they took all the steps that are recommended currently to make sure that I'm safe when I'm inside their structure.
I think that's a really excellent point, KJ, that it's on top of it being about safety, health and safety, it's also about making your customers feel comfortable and excellent customer service. Now is a great time to really elevate your customer service skills. So I think that you drew a really good connection there between the two. So Katie, yeah.
Kathy, to add on what KJ said, it's important that we think about this from a couple of different perspectives. We all keep thinking about like the employees walking in the door, but there's a couple of things beyond them getting in the door that you have to put into thought, and they're the things we forget about. So if you have a coffee pot in your office that everybody shares, you probably don't want to use a shared coffee pot that everybody's touching. Your refrigerator, put a practice in place where there's wipes next to the refrigerator door handle. Like the dishwashers, it's those kinds of stuff. We're likely to think, oh, put everybody in a separate office 6 feet away from each other, and then we're going to go all handle the same grimy coffee pot. Like, it's those kinds of things that we really need to put some extra thought to. You know, what's your restroom situation? What's the, is there a smoking hut that people are usually going and standing at? And what do you do about those kinds of things? We need to go past just get the employees in the building. But KJ mentioned vendors. If you've got FedEx, UPS, Postmen bringing stuff in, you need to think about what's the expectation for how they're going to interact with your people and set that standard for folks. And then come up, like, remind people, we're all thinking about wiping down the mail at home, but are we going to think about that when we get to the office? What are the things that maybe have been in place as sort of tried and true processes that you need to work with your employees to think about? Find the person in your office that is, you know, the biggest germaphobe, and I say that lovingly because this person has probably saved my life in the last 6 weeks, because I don't think that way. But those folks have probably already always put some things in place that they won't do, and they can help give you really good advice on where to think about community space, your break rooms, your lunch spaces, your tables where people are eating. That's the kind of spaces you need to be thinking about too.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a really great point. Work with your team on these things, because then they have that ownership of it as well. Excellent point. So Katie, kind of shifting over to maybe more administrative side. When it comes to handbooks and people are looking to maybe update their handbook or maybe add new procedures or policies in there, what are some areas that they maybe need to pay attention to or need to add?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting that we even had some clients who were just working on new handbooks, and we're already revamping them based on what's going on. And the reason it's important is because, again, your handbook is supposed to be the reference guide that employees can look to say, if I don't know the answer, this is where I would get it. So the minute you have a policy that you are now saying, hey, disregard that, you've undermined your entire policy handbook. So you want to be really cautious of doing that. So one of the really obvious places is telecommute policies. Many companies had a telecommute policy in their handbook if people were allowed to work from home on occasion or even all of the time. I have a client who they had a major telecommute policy because all of their employees were remote. The challenge is that telecommute policy says working from home means working from home in a distraction-free environment where you are not caring for dependents or children.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that policy is no longer right. And yet, so essentially what we said in the short term was like, hey guys, we're waiving that part of the handbook, which made sense in the moment. But you're now 6 weeks in, and for many clients, they're not coming back anytime soon because they found out telecommuting works just fine. But they're going to leave this section in their handbook that says you can't have dependents and children. So they've essentially told their employees parts of our handbook no longer apply. And that's a dangerous road to start to take. So now is the time to update those sections. So that's one of them. The other section that we're finding we need to take a look at for many companies is their paid time off policies, because some companies have had people using their paid time off during this time period. So you have to decide what does that mean for the end of the year. And the other one, the flip side of that from paid time off is if you have a policy that says if you don't use your PTO by the end of the year, you lose it, you may need to rethink that, because if you haven't had people using PTO, they're going to get to December and if they have canceled spring break, probably every summer vacation they had planned, you are going to have large numbers of employees with 3, 4, 5 weeks of vacation that they have not used, and everybody's going to want to take it in the month of December, which may not be feasible and certainly is likely not a great outcome for you and your employees. But if you can get ahead of that now and say, hey, you know what, we see this coming, we're going to change our policy for next year and give you through first quarter to roll things over or any variation of, you'll be ahead of the game, and your employees will walk away feeling like you're thinking about them and you are caring about them, and you're not trying to see how you can be the winner on all of this, which is an important message to send your folks.
Awesome. Yeah, we're already living that Christmas to January 1 feel this whole time.
Yeah.
So, I'm kind of dreading that that time just for myself, my own sanity. So that's an excellent point. Thank you so much, Katie. Turning it over to Joe. I did have a question for you when it comes to the business side, and if you're an owner, how to protect yourself and your business during these times. What are some steps that folks can start taking to protect their business and make sure that everything is set up for success for the future?
So as far as the immediate threat, like I said earlier, all the best practices that are recommended by the government organizations you should be adhering to. As far as overall liability protection, your business structure is very important. So maybe you started off as a sole proprietor, which is a legal classification for a business. And maybe now you're starting to hire employees or contractors. So you might want to look at setting up an LLC or a specific type of a corporation, depending on your tax needs. And then it's always a good idea, and this is a little closer to home with what I do, it's always a good idea with business owners to have separate trust for their personal assets. It's just one more layer of protection in case the LLC is ever pierced, is ever disregarded by a court, then we still might have another layer of protection from liability.
Absolutely. Excellent point. So is there, just because a lot of businesses are going to be changing coming out of COVID, is there any reason that they need to go from an LLC back to a sole proprietor?
Not typically. A lot of those considerations are going to be tax questions for your CPA. So if there's some reason, some tax reason that you want to reclassify, then you can bring an attorney in to do that. But from a purely liability standpoint, typically there's not a reason to go backwards.
Gotcha. Thank you so much, Joe.
Mhm.
Really important questions. And I know that the questions around LLC, sole proprietor, business trust can get very specific per each business. Well, not can, they are very specific for each business. So thank you so much for sharing that. And if any of you have questions about that, don't hesitate to reach out to Joe. Kathy, or Katie, sorry. You and Kathy, your names are so similar. Kind of following up on some handbook policies and administrative policies, can you give a very brief overview of the FFCRA, the Family First Coronavirus Act, and what are some things that people need to pay attention to?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for this question, because this is one that when it happened, especially if you had people telecommuting, you immediately went, oh, I don't have to worry about that. And you wrote it off. And it actually is really important. And as people are reopening, it's becoming almost immediately part of the conversation in deciding how people are coming back. So there's two key parts to the FFCRA. One piece of it is the emergency paid leave piece, and the second piece is the emergency sick leave. The emergency paid leave is probably where the biggest misnomer is on this particular law. I continue to hear people say, oh, I have fewer than 50 employees, so I'm exempt from it. That is not necessarily the case. There are more standards than just the 50 employees. And most importantly, you have to decide whether or not you want to make yourself exempt under the Department of Labor regulations. And there's actually some cases where our employers have said, either I'm not actually exempt even though I only have 20 people, or based on their employee situation, they were better off not to exempt themselves. So there's potential for either of those. But essentially that emergency family medical leave part covers the situation where you have parents who cannot come into the office because they need to care for their child whose school and or place of care have closed. And that's really interesting because when it happened, we all went, oh, okay, so that just means through the end of the school year. But just in the last 10 days, camps and daycares, camps have almost all canceled. If they haven't yet, they likely are. And daycares, a lot of them are not accepting new folks. And more importantly, I was on the phone this morning with a client. She has a first grader and a third grader. So as a first and a third grader, they don't have a place for those at a daycare. She sends them to camps all summer long. Every single one of her camps had canceled for the summer. So she now, but as third grader, can't leave those kids at home by themselves. And so she now, if they start to stop telecommuting, cannot work. She technically, depending on the size of the company and the situation, she would be covered under the emergency family leave part, which says she gets 12 weeks of paid leave of absence, and her job is protected, meaning you can't replace her during that time period. So that eFMLA is a really important piece to understand. If you've had people telecommuting and now you're like, nope, everybody has to come back, that decision has implications to it. The second piece is the emergency sick leave piece, and that refers to individuals who either get sick with COVID themselves, are caring for someone who's sick with COVID, or if they have been told by a doctor that they need to quarantine for some reason. And that could include an underlying health condition as part of that. And so again, when we just said, okay, everybody go home, and either I'm going to temporarily furlough people or they're going to telecommute, it wasn't that big of a deal. But now that people are coming back in the office and you are likely to have folks that do get something, or you have people on your team who can't come in because they have an underlying health condition, you now have to worry about making sure that you understand the emergency sick leave piece. And that covers, for a full-time employee, it covers up to 80 hours of sick leave, pay. And then if it's care for someone else, you get 2/3 of that 80 hours. So there's a lot to know and understand in that law. And again, it's the one that we were so overwhelmed by what was going on. A lot of folks missed it.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Katie. And KJ, just so that we can help spread this and make sure that our employees are staying safe, can you talk a little bit about PPE in the workplace and if businesses have to require that?
Okay, if your business is requiring PPE, what you need to remember is that then that employer is responsible for providing that. I can't tell you to get a face mask and then not provide it for you. I can't tell you to have gloves and not provide it for you. So that's the first step in there, that you are doing those. And if they have if you've gone beyond the regular, I don't see anyone wearing one today, but if you've gone beyond the regular mask that we're buying from somebody down the street or whatever, if you have a mask that's above the N95, that is a face-fitting, form-fitting face piece that needs to be fitted for them correctly, and they need to be trained on the proper use and the care of those types of masks. You can't just say, here, wear this mask. You have to provide it for them, and you have to provide the training for them. The other thing with gloves, and Brian, you'll know where I'm coming from with this one, is if you have someone put gloves on and they're handling products, how do you take those gloves off? There's a correct way to take off the gloves in the right way to not contaminate yourself as you're taking that off. So that's another part of your training process.
So where can folks go if they want to learn more about how to fit, how to properly take off gloves, and maybe some other things? Where can they go for those types of resources?
Those types of basic, donning and doffing is the terms that are used for personal protective equipment. We can do that here at Command Solutions. But as far as if they're already a company that has those face-fitting, a PAPR respirator or another type of respirator, they're already going to have someone that they deal with that's providing those, and also where the training is. So I don't actually have a personal lead on that. When I was at the fire department, we used to go to a place in Maryland Heights. Brian, do you remember the name of that? Reese Environmental used to do stuff for us down there. Things like that that can do that quality testing. Because if you're going to be in those types of respirators, you have to make sure that it is filtering out. And it's actually a little smoke test that goes along. And you have to turn your head left and right and up and down and all that to make sure that nothing is getting past that.
Yeah. So Joe, I have just kind of a follow-up question for you. Legally, let's say a business is giving their employees the correct PPE, offering the training, but that employee is not wearing any of the PPE or following the training. What happens then? What steps legally should that business take to make sure that the business is safe and they're protecting other employees and customers?
So that's an HR issue that should be handled like any other HR issue. So I'll give you an example. If you own a warehouse and you have workers working for you, and part of the safe practices and the requirements of employment are, you go up in a forklift to reach a high shelf, you wear a safety harness. What would you do if an employee didn't do that? It's the same concept. So you're going to process that through HR, and I'll refer to Katie on that. But you're probably going to give them a warning. You're probably going to try to retrain them so that you don't have to fire them if possible. And then eventually, it would escalate to that if they just absolutely refuse to comply.
Yeah, Katie?
Yeah, so great advice. First and foremost, back to that policies you need to update. You need to have one for this if you're requiring people to wear PPE. And it's important to know that the St. Louis County and the St. Louis City guidelines that were just released on Friday appear to be different than St. Charles County. So if you have multiple locations and some of them are in St. Louis County or St. Louis City, you need to be really clear that those rules are different. And at least at first glance, we are working through those quickly today, but St. Louis County and City are requiring employers to require their employees to wear masks. So you need to know that. The other piece, though, so then you need the policy. You need to enforce the policy. But I will tell you, probably what I fear might be one of the biggest mistakes that employers make on this is they're going to enforce the policy, and then the owner is not going to wear their own mask. So
yeah,
that would be very dangerous to you. And I don't know why it is, but like we have that sense sometimes when our owner had that, like, I made this for everybody else, but it didn't apply to me. And so if you are in the office, you also need to be wearing your mask. If you're going to have a policy that says an employee gets terminated if they don't wear it, then you need to make sure that you're wearing it, and any member of the leadership team is wearing it, because that would undermine any policy you might have.
awesome. Yeah, excellent advice. Leadership from the top down,
Kathy,
right?
there's one. Kathy, there's one other thing that I want to mention that I think is important for people to know right now. While the St. Louis County and City rules are different than St. Charles County, so the stay-at-home orders apply for you based on not only where you live but where you work. So if you have employees that are live in St. Louis County and they are traveling to St. Charles County has lifted their stay-at-home orders, but St. Louis County has not. So if you tell an employee from St. Louis that they need to come to your location in St. Charles and it's a non-essential job, you have just told your employee to violate the St. Louis stay-at-home order, which is against the law. So you really need to think about this as we go through this staggered reopening. It is not just where your facility is located. It also matters where your employees are.
Excellent. And that kind of leads into the next and final question before we open it up to attendees and their questions, Katie. What if you're a business, you've gone through all the processes, you have safety processes, and you start calling employees and they're uncomfortable to about coming back, or they don't want to come back? Can you talk about that? I know there's a lot of different scenarios, but can you elaborate more on that?
Absolutely. There's scenarios, and I will tell you, this is probably the hardest part, because for employers, all of these scenarios require you to have conversations that from an HR perspective, we would always be telling you, don't you dare ask that employee that question. Yeah. But suddenly we have to. So you have the authority to ask these questions, and you have a right to ask these questions to understand. So for example, my clients this morning, we have one employee on their team who is afraid to come back, doesn't want to. They do not have it's a dental office, so they don't have an option to do telecommute. They need to be in the office. They made the decision to continue to leave her on a temporary furlough until the point that, they absolutely need to have her back. And then at the point that they say, you know what, you're the last team member back, we need you to come in. If she says no, then they'll have to do a layoff. On the flip side, though, you need to know, because if it's not just fear, if it truly is an underlying health condition, then the FSCRA kicks in, and you need to make sure that you're handling that the right way if you're going to require them to come back before they want to. So there's a lot of different scenarios. You need to kind of go employee by employee. Our recommendation is that literally owners are calling each employee to say, here is what our reopen plan looks like. How does that impact you? And that helps you find out if they're going to have a child care issue you have to think through. If they're going to have an underlying health condition you need to think through. How many staff do you actually need in the office, and can you time them appropriately? We started, when everybody went home, we started working with our clients to figure out what were their strategies to have that. Now we're on the flip side. We're going through client by client and actually talking them through, okay, let's go through the list of your employees. What needs to happen with each of, who can come in, who can't come in? Do you need people in? How can you make this work? We have clients that are splitting shifts. So part of their teams come in on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Part of them come in Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. We've got one client, I like this idea. They're doing every other week is telecommute for people. So I come in this week, and then the cleaning staff cleans everything over the weekend, and then the second team is coming in the second week, because they do have some parts of their jobs that need to be in the office, but they can work mostly functional telecommute. So they're doing an every other week kind of plan, which gives the cleaning crew opportunity to get in there in between and do a full cleaning. So those are some of the things you really need to think through, but my best advice is have a conversation with each and every employee, have it with empathy, because if somebody says they're scared, like they really are, there's very few people out there faking this, like they're scared. Also, I've heard people ask, like, well, what if my employee refuses to come back because they're making more on unemployment? That's actually pretty easy to solve, because you can simply report to the state of Missouri that you have recalled the employee. We put together what we call as a recall letter. You give that to the employee, and then you share that with the state of Missouri. And once you have filed that, they no longer are eligible for unemployment. So that one's actually a pretty easy one to handle. And then the last piece is just really make sure you've thought through who needs to be in the office. Even if you can have some of your team still telecommute and bring in the folks that do have a part of the job, this does not have to be an all one size fits all.
Awesome. Excellent point about the unemployment benefits that are happening right now. Thank you so much for addressing that, Katie. We're going to move into Q&A with our attendees. So I'm going to stop recording. Hold on. Takes me